Good afternoon. We're going to get started again. Good afternoon, everyone. This is an interesting follow-up for those of you who are sitting in on the last session, which talked a lot about how higher education is not changing fast enough. Over the next half hour or so, we're going to talk about some significant changes in higher education, not among those top 200 institutions that you heard about, but among an institution that perhaps you wouldn't suspect is at the leading edge of change. I'm Tim Renick. I'm Vice President at Georgia State University in Atlanta. I'm going to start with some sobering data, but I promise you this presentation will be a lot more upbeat than the previous one. This is from the New York Times. It's data showing the percent of Americans who hold the bachelor's degree, but it's disaggregated by economic quartile. It covers the last 40 years from 1970 to the present. And what you see is that there have been significant changes in bachelor's attainment over that time period, if you're in the top half of the economic spectrum. In fact, if you're among the top 25% of Americans by annual household income, the prospects have gotten considerably better that you'll hold a college degree. Back in 1970, about 40% of the population did. Now it's more than doubled to over 80%. But if you're among the bottom 25% of Americans by annual household income, the picture is a much more sobering one. In 40 years, with all the efforts that we've made nationally, with programs like Pell, with state efforts and individual campus efforts, we've moved the needle by 2 percentage points, from 6% to 8%. And in fact, the gap between the wealthiest and the least wealthy Americans, as you can see graphically in this chart, is not narrowing, but getting wider. In fact, it's basically doubled over the last 40 years. We all know this is not right. It's not the way it should be. And it's one of the ills that plagues our society with regard to inequalities based on income level, race, first-generation college status, and so forth. But what do we do about it? At least at first glance, an institution like Georgia State would not be a logical candidate for transformative change. Georgia State is a big urban university in downtown Atlanta. Perhaps its most distinctive claim to fame is it's only a couple blocks from the birthplace of Reverend Martin Luther King, from Ebenezer Baptist Church, where both he and his father preached, and from his gravesite. But for most of its history, Georgia State did not live up to the Reverend Martin Luther King's ideals. For one thing, it was segregated into the 1960s, and even as recently as 10 years ago, it was a poster child for the underperforming public university. Overall, the graduation rates hovered around 30%, and there were these persistent and pernicious gaps in achievement in graduation rates between students based on race and ethnicity. Year after year, the white students would outperform the African American and Latino students. Again, we know that this is not the way it should be. The interceding decade would not give you any impression that Georgia State would be the type of place where you'd see a transformation. For one thing, the demographic shifts going on in Atlanta and going on at Georgia State would seem to suggest that graduation rates might be going down, at least by conventional wisdom. About 10 years ago, 12 years ago, 60% of Georgia State's population, student population, was white. Now 63% is non-white. Georgia State, like much of the South, has merged into an institution that is increasingly diverse. It became a majority-minority institution several years ago. The state of Georgia probably is going to do the same over the next generation. Even more troubling from the perspective of the prospects of students graduating is the economic health of the students who enroll at Georgia State. Over the last 7 or 8 years since the onset of the recession, the number of students enrolled at Georgia State who are Pell eligible has basically doubled. So it's gone from about 30% of the population to almost 60% of the student population. For those of you who don't know, just as a reference point, the average family in America, the average Pell student in America last year came from a family with an annual household income of about $23,000 a year. So all of these students are in the bottom band of that first chart we were looking at. All of these students are basically the students that American higher education has failed over the last 40 years. One other detail, by the way, the state of Georgia and the city of Atlanta were hit harder by the recession than just about any other place in the country. Real estate default rates, unemployment rates, and so forth led the nation. And the types of students Georgia State enrolls, non-white, first-generation, low-income students, were hit particularly hard by these economic changes. That meant that the economy in the state of Georgia was going downhill, and the Georgia State lost about $40 million in state appropriations between 2008 and 2012. As I'm saying, not exactly the recipe for a transformation in student outcomes, demographic shifts, economic challenges, and so forth. But what Georgia State made a commitment to doing about a decade ago is something that is uncommon in higher education. What Georgia State said, given its lack of resources, small endowment, relatively modest reputation nationally, and so forth, was we needed to find a different way to approach these problems. The same old would not suffice. The same old has produced those widening gaps between low-income and upper-income students. And so what we made a commitment to do was really to take the data seriously, to recognize that we had limited resources, they needed to be focused on what would make a difference, and to focus them on what would make a difference, we had to let the data tell us where the problems for our students really rested. And so we aggressively piloted innovations. We were very willing to try things that hadn't been proven elsewhere, but try them at the small scale, track the data carefully, see what works, and then revise in order to see if we could make the innovations and the interventions more effective. And then probably the most important distinction between what we did and some of our peer institutions, we scaled these innovations. So Georgia State currently enrolls over 50,000 students. If we have a program, even a highly effective one, that impacts 80 students, 150 students, even 400 students, that's not going to make a substantial difference in the overall outcomes for our students. We need interventions that touch thousands and tens of thousands of students every semester. And that's what we worked on conceiving, data-based innovations that could truly be scaled across a modestly funded, large public university like Georgia State. So let me give you a couple examples of how these types of innovations have changed the nature of what we do at Georgia State. We looked at the data and we found 5 years ago the average student graduating from Georgia State was going through over 2.5 majors before they reached the point of graduation. Low-income first-generation students can't afford to go through 2.5 majors because every time you switch majors, you're creating wasted credit hours. You've taken courses that no longer apply to your new degree program. You're postponing time to degree. But what we realized is that the problem with this particular phenomenon was really on us. It was the way we had structured the university. Georgia State, like a lot of big public universities, has grown incrementally over the years, exponentially over the years. And yeah, that might be a real Freudian slip there. And what we realized is we had reached the point of almost 100 undergraduate majors, over 3,000 courses. We were bringing students in and basically telling them to pick. And if they didn't pick wisely, they were wasting time, wasting credit hours, oftentimes dropping out with debt before they reached the point of completion. What we did about 4 years ago is change the whole way we admit students into the university. Now they come in and we ask them to pick what we call a meta major. This is a large topic area that may be of interest to them. Things like STEM, health professions, education, humanities, and the arts. We have guides to help them through this process. They go through analytical exercises, they meet with advisors and so forth. But the point is to get them to have some general area that they know they're interested in. Then they take all their classes during the fall semester with other students who are interested in the same field. So they travel in all 5 classes with a group cohort of 25 students. Sometimes they're the only 25 students, sometimes they're in a much larger class. But they build up friendships, study partnerships, and so forth. But more than that, we have an identifiable group of students who we know are interested in this particular area. And so we push programming at them. The business faculty will host evening lecture series or host events where the students can come as mixers and coffees and so forth and get to know the faculty, so that by the time they finish their freshman year, they know the difference between marketing and accounting. And they're not deciding in the beginning of their sophomore, or worse, the beginning of their junior year, that they don't want to do accounting because it requires too much math. Discover that when you're in your freshman year and use your financial aid and your choices wisely as a result. Does this kind of structuring make a difference? Well, in a 2-year period, we've been able to lower the number of changes that Georgia State students are making among majors by over 30%, just by a structural change in the way we admit students into the university. We had huge problems with our math requirements. All students have to pass college math. Back in 2008, over 40% of the students who took our introductory math courses were getting grades of D's, F's, or they were withdrawing from the course before they got any grade. Again, low-income first-generation students can't afford to waste their aid on courses that don't get them any closer to graduation. So we changed the way we did things. Again, this was a problem that was ours, not the students. Whoever thought that a best way to teach a first-generation low-income college student pre-calculus is to put them in a room this size and have somebody stand up in front of it and talk at them for 3 hours a week, and then give them a midterm and final? What we did is flipped all the classrooms. The students now meet with their professor in a regular classroom 1 hour a week. 3 hours a week, they're meeting with the professor in dedicated computer labs. They're working at their own terminals, but all working on the same chapter of the material, and they're using adaptive learning exercises, so they're learning at their own pace. The slower students don't get left behind, because if they're trying to master a basic concept, they get more questions until they can build up some competency. The faster students, the more advanced students don't get bored because they get more challenging questions, and everybody's getting hundreds of bits of immediate feedback personalized to them every hour that they're in the lab. Not surprisingly, the results are much, much better. So in a 6-year, 7-year period, we've lowered that failure rate from over 40% to under 20%. We've converted every single seat we offer of introductory math to adaptive learning flipped classroom. That was 7,500 seats last year, and that's 1,800 more students getting through their math requirement the first time out. Why don't we leverage the fact that we have lots of low-income students enrolled? One characteristic of low-income students is many of them are on federal work study, meaning part of their aid package requires them to work for the university. In the past, we used to have them work in the library or work answering phones at a front desk. Over the last 6 or 7 years, we've begun to use data to give them more focused job assignments. We look at the courses in the undergraduate curriculum that have the highest failure rate, and then we look at the grades achieved in those same courses by students who are on federal work study, and we correlate them. Now we pull those students out of their assignment in the library or at a front desk. We pay them to go through training. We pay them in order to sit in on the same class they already succeeded in, so they get to know the new students and instructor, and we pay them to do instructional sessions during the week. There's an inverse correlation between the students who show up for a professor's office hours and their race and ethnicity characteristics. Low-income students are much less likely to knock on a professor's door and say, I don't understand what's going on. Students are much more likely to show up for help with a fellow undergraduate, and they do much, much better. About half a letter grade better in these courses, and the tutors themselves are graduating at about a 15% better clip than they did when they were answering phones or working in the library. And how about the problem of aid for our students? We looked at our data about financial aid about 5 years ago and found that we were dropping over 1,000 students every semester because they couldn't cover the charges of their tuition and fees. When we looked at the data more closely, we found that a large number of these students, in fact, the biggest single group, were seniors, close to graduating, having gotten through all the hoops, passed their math requirements, gotten through their introductory courses, but they were running out of eligibility for other aid programs. Their Pell was running out, their loan eligibility was running out. So in some cases, they were 1 or 2 semesters away from graduating, and they were stopping out without getting their degrees. A study in California shows that if a college student stops out, only about 37% ever re-enroll and finish up their degrees. So this is really a tragedy. So what we did is started filling these students' accounts with microgrants. No application required. We ran the data, looked for students with genuine unmet financial need and who were on track for graduation. And if they had a small gap as we were dropping the students the same day, we would just fill it in. first couple of semesters we did this, we had multiple students hanging up on us because they thought it was a scam. They couldn't believe anybody from Georgia State had really given them, as you can see, the average grant, $900. But this can make all the difference. We've given over 7,000 of these grants over the last 4 years. 70% of the seniors who get one of these grants graduate within 2 semesters of getting the grant. Probably the biggest project that we've engaged in using data has to do with our academic advising. We found in the data that we were dropping and losing too many students without ever getting a chance to reach out to them and try to help. By the time we recognized their academic problems, they were already gone. They had dropped out of the university. So what we did is we used 10 years of our data, over 2.5 million grades, 140,000 student records. What we were doing is looking in the data for characteristics of what behaviors on an academic level led in the past to students dropping out. What correlated to them flunking out in historical data? And what we found is over 800 different things. 800 things historically that students did that had a statistically significant impact upon their chances of dropping out. Now we run every night as we're updating our student data, we look for all 800 things among our whole 50,000 student body. And when one of those things is identified, an alert goes off, the advisor assigned to the student is notified, and some kind of outreach is given within 48 hours. A lot of this is just common sense, but it's common sense that higher education has never delivered in a personalized way at scale. For instance, most majors at college have these maps, these sequences that students are supposed to take to get through their programming. This is the map for a chemistry major at Georgia State. But the reality is that few institutions actually follow these maps relative to registration and make sure that students are registering for the right classes. And at Georgia State every year there were thousands of instances of students signing up for the wrong classes. Now, an alert goes off as they register, and we know whether a student is in a course that doesn't apply to their degree program. It doesn't mean that a chemistry major is not allowed to take a course in Roman architecture if they want to, but they're going to know beforehand that that particular course does not apply to their degree program and is going to be an extra cost and extra time for them. We use predictive analytics, some of it again, just kind of common sense things. What we found is a correlation between the first grade that a student gets in what becomes his or her major and their chances of graduating on time. We've run this for every major at Georgia State. These are a couple examples. If you look in the center, if you're a political science major at Georgia State, get an A or B in your first political science course, you're graduating on time at a 75% clip. You get a C in that first class, you're graduating on time at a 25% clip. But what historically has higher education, what historically did Georgia State do with that C student? Absolutely nothing. In fact, worse than nothing, because if you're a first-generation low-income student, what we ended up doing was misleading the student into thinking he or she's prepared for more advanced work in upper-level courses. But what, of course, happens is the political science student who got the C then takes the upper-level course where there's more reading and more writing. Whatever weakness is evidenced in the C grade that they had already received becomes exacerbated, and the C grades turn into Ds and Fs. And when a student accumulates 4 or 5 Ds and Fs, then we would intervene. How backwards, and how inappropriate, and how wasteful for the students who are caught in this system. So now an alert goes off. There's a sit-down conversation with the student. It may be a diagnosis goes on, maybe there are reading issues, writing issues, maybe it's financial or personal. But let's discover what the problem is at the front end, not after 6 months of the student struggling, wasting time and wasting money in the process. We use analytics to help students think through majors based upon the patterns of courses taken and the grades received in those courses by historical students at Georgia State. We can actually talk to students about what their chances of succeeding in different majors. When we first introduced this new platform, our faculty thought this is a system for moving students to easier majors. Everybody's going to flock to whatever is the easiest major at Georgia State. Since we've been live with this system for 4 years now, we found just the opposite is the case. The 2 fastest growing majors are biology and computer science. Why? Because we're finally giving students a fighting chance. Before, a first-generation low-income student would come in with weak math skills, say they wanted to be pre-med, and we would shove them into the deep end. If they could swim already from whatever they had picked up in high school, fine. But if not, we would blame the student or blame K through 12. Now we have alerts going off as early as the second week of the semester. If a student has weaknesses in math and wants to be a STEM major, they have a chance to get that remediated and a chance to actually succeed in their career goals. And we're connecting students to career goals by using data. This particular program allows for every major we offer at Georgia State, students to see what the 25 to 40 careers are that most likely result from that particular major. It's eye-opening for students, especially first-generation students who often have a very limited range of expectations and understandings about what they can do with a college degree. Wasn't initially popular with the chair of philosophy because telemarketer emerged as one of the 25 top careers in philosophy. But in fairness, so did all kinds of interesting careers in law and business and so forth that most philosophy majors and maybe even a lot of philosophy faculty would not have imagined would be as prominent as they are. But the trick here is scale. So over the last 12 months, we've had 49,000 one-on-one interventions between our staff and our students that were prompted at alerts from the system. 49,000 things that we're correcting now that we weren't correcting just 4 years ago and giving students a fighting chance. Almost immediately when we went live with this program, we saw a 3 or 4% increase in retention rates in the number of students and percent of students who are hanging around and persisting. Most gains among low-income, first-generation students. Every year since we've had this system in place, we've seen increases both in the number of credit hours students are attempting and in the percent of the credit hours they're passing. And we've begun to see declines in time to degree and the cost of education at Georgia State. So over the last 2 years alone, because so many of these errors are being corrected, the average graduating senior has taken 6 fewer credit hours to complete all of their requirements. Not because we've lowered academic requirements, but because we've made it easier for students to navigate the insane bureaucracy that higher ed has created. That's about $6 million, by the way, in savings for the class of 15 compared to the class of 13. And the gains have been even bigger for our at-risk student populations, our African American students, our Latino students, first generation, and low-income students. All of this work in predictive analytics and proactive advising has led to a major project of the University Innovation Alliance, this grouping of 11 big public institutions. All of us over the next 4 years are implementing a similar system of proactive engaging students using data. And we're tracking it for the federal government, so we'll produce what will be for the first time a scientifically controlled study of the impacts of these sorts of interventions on especially low-income and first-generation college students. How do we afford this at Georgia State? Well, the reality is these kind of interventions, if done well, more than pay for themselves. In fact, they got us through the recession. We lost $40 million in a 4-year period. Our budget actually went up every year because our revenues were going up. If you hold on to thousands of additional students, that means thousands of additional dollars in tuition and fees that come to your university. Every 1 point we raise our retention rate at Georgia State, that's worth about $3 million in continuing revenues for the university. And all of this has been good for Georgia State. As I said, not a particularly well-known national university. It's gotten us all kinds of attention in the media. We were invited to the White House, and President Obama talked about our programs. That's not why we're doing it, though. This is why we're doing it. Over the last 5 years, we've increased the number of students graduating from Georgia State by 1,700 every year. We've moved our graduation ceremonies from the basketball arena on campus to the Georgia Dome, where the Falcons play, which is where that photo was taken because we ran out of room. That's a 30% increase, but look where the gains have come from. It's come from all of the at-risk student populations that largely have been failed by American higher education over the last couple generations. We're up 80% in degrees conferred to African Americans, 90% in degrees conferred to Pell, 120% in degrees conferred to Hispanic students. These kind of interventions at scale do make a difference. Same is true for our graduation rates. They're not where we want them to be yet, but they've basically doubled over the last decade. And those achievement gaps that were so persistent are largely gone. In fact, the news is even better when we extend the tracking of our students beyond just Georgia State. So we look at the students who started with us and ask the question, how many graduated either from Georgia State or some other institution? Low-income students tend to be much more transient than their middle-income and upper-income colleagues. And what you can see is for the students who started with us, that over 75%, despite those demographic changes, are graduating. There's almost no distinction evident based on race, ethnicity. Georgia State is the only public university of 15,000 students or more this year at which the Black, Latino, first-generation, and low-income students will all graduate at rates at or above that of the student body overall. Again, these kind of interventions make a difference. And another interesting distinction, that Georgia State over the last 4 years has emerged as the college or university in the US that is conferring the most bachelor's degree to African American students. It's the first time that distinction has gone to a non-HBCU. So one last data point, go back to the national picture. Each of those diamonds represents a national university. And what it shows is the correlation between the percent of low-income students on a campus, the percent of students on Pell, versus graduation rates. And you see there's a steep incline. As the Pell rates go up, the graduation rates go down. 6 years ago, Georgia State was actually below that dotted line. And what has happened with these interventions as we've scaled them up is we become more and more of an outlier. The trick, though, is that we need to move American higher education to the point where the story of Georgia State is no longer an outlier, but becomes the norm, becomes a way in which higher education supports and guides on a personal level each and every student that enrolls. Thank you very much.